back. Thanks for joining us. My name is Damian Gallagher, and I'm happy to be bringing you another segment of 6 weeks of Groundhog. Today, I'm joined by our Industrials analyst team, Peter Garner and Erik Cianci, and remotely, we have our Director of Industrials Research, Scott Blumenthal, with us. Thank you all for joining us. I know we got a lot of great questions to get through, so let's jump right into it. When people think of investments in AI, they tend to think of tech, right? They're often not thinking about industrials, but what might they be missing by not looking at the industrial sector?
Yeah, I'll start with this one.
Sure.
So there's a lot of attention that's being paid to semiconductors and the Magnificent Seven, and we get that. But as small cap investors, we think that there is a broad ecosystem that is not optional, but required when you're building out these data centers. Things like the backup power generation, the transformers, the air handlers and chillers. These represent hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. And when you're only looking at the biggest companies, you're missing out on a lot of adjacencies that we think there's a lot of growth there.
In addition to some of the components Erik mentioned, there are others such as power distribution units and uninterruptible power supplies as well. And as he mentioned, all of these are critical to data center operations. It's easy to get caught up in our AI smartphone paradigm, but this other equipment doesn't get delivered virtually. It comes in by truck or rail. It's unloaded and set in place using heavy industrial machinery, material handling equipment like forklifts and cranes. All of this building also requires a lot of building material and employs many construction workers. This creates ongoing industrial service opportunities after they're built. You have to maintain it all. And finally, the data centers are being built so rapidly that they alone are expected to add about 2% to growth in annual US domestic energy consumption, which will require incremental increases in power generating capacity from a portfolio of energy sources for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. And at the risk of, kind of stating the obvious here, all of that investment in building new energy generation systems is going to require an expansion in the production of the raw materials that you need to build them with. Yeah. And when you're thinking of these energy generation systems, whether, it's like a large natural gas turbine or a nuclear reactor, they require high performance materials. You can't really build them out of traditional steel-based alloys because they can't withstand the high temperatures or the sustained periods of use that you require. So, this could come in with more exotic metals like niobium or hafnium, or just more exotic steel alloys incorporating nickel or titanium. Right. So these are critical components in the build out of energy generation from more traditional sources or alternatives like nuclear. And really, there are only a handful of companies, not just in the United States, but frankly in the world, that have both the knowledge base and the capacity to produce these materials. Right. And that's where we think that small cap has a unique investment opportunity with these specialty materials producers.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, thank you all. So let's move to the next question. Erik, I'll come back to you. We've seen a lot of volatility following the DeepSeek news.
Yeah.
How does that change your investment thesis on industrials?
The short answer, I guess, is it's too early to tell, right? But I think a little bit more broadly, over the last 2 weeks or so, we've seen all the Mag 7, all the hyperscalers report. None of them seem to indicate any sort of slowdown in the amount of CapEx or the cadence of that CapEx. So yeah, maybe in the late 2020s, 2030, maybe that starts to look a little different, but we don't see any change in the near or medium term thesis.
Okay, so good to hear no threats right now.
No.
Well, Peter, so kind of talking about change, given the change in administration, what areas do you guys expect, and you specifically, Peter, that are going to be most impacted by this new administration?
Yeah, there are two that stand out to me most immediately. I think the one that's been in the news the most is tariff policy. Yeah. Right. The new administration has made it pretty clear that it intends to use tariffs as diplomatic leverage, not only just to incentivize trading partners to buy more American goods, which will boost domestic manufacturing, but also It should provide a short-term boost to domestic producers in the sense that the cost to operate will be temporarily lower. And the other big example I would say is an energy policy. A big goal of the incoming administration is to increase domestic energy production. And while this is a topic our energy team could provide a more comprehensive answer to, industrial companies certainly stand to benefit from increased energy generation, production, and exploration. And not just in traditional energy generation technologies as well, but also in solutions like nuclear power.
Yeah, this is also, I think, the current administration actual improvements in overall business sentiment due to having an administration committed to reducing the regulatory burden on business, and also one that's perceived to be more friendly towards business. And finally, Damien, I think the ongoing effort to onshore critical manufacturing capabilities back to the US and away from adversarial countries should also favor domestic producers, and that's positive coming from the administration.
Yeah, Scott, I'm glad you mentioned that last point because it kind of ties to something that Peter was saying earlier. There was a focus in the last administration, and there certainly will be in this administration, on trying to establish as much of a domestic supply chain in some of those critical raw materials that are used in those natural gas turbines that Peter was talking about. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
All right. Well, thank you all. I think we've got enough time here for one more question, and it's really our big, bold prediction question. So finishing things up, Scott, I'll start with you for this. Where do we currently sit within industrials, and what is your outlook for 2025? Anything big and exciting that you would like to share?
Well, I think for the better part of 2 years or so, the United States industrial economy has been either in or on the cusp of recession. We may have pulled off the rare soft landing. The companies themselves tend to be our best information sources, which is why at Emerald we emphasize developing these relationships. This week's January 2025 ISM PMI report was the first report indicating expansion in the industrial economy in 27 months. And so that reflects not only an increase in activity, but in what is seasonally a slow month, but also an improvement in sentiment, notably a willingness to hire new employees. All of this comes from survey respondents, the companies themselves, which makes it even more encouraging. And so we currently characterize the industrial sector outlook as bottoming. The bottoming is encouraging, as I mentioned, as is usually the case. We have some subsectors of the industrial economy that are doing well and have done well. Pete and Erik will discuss a couple of those, but I'll conclude here with a comment after they're done about those who have struggled.
Yeah. And so one of the areas that stands out to me most immediately is in commercial aerospace and defense. It was one of the strongest subsectors in industrials last year, and that seems poised to continue into 2025 in my mind. You're seeing air travel continue to grow at very strong rates, averaging 7 to 10% per year, and it's well exceeded pre-pandemic levels by this point. So not only should this drive results for the airline companies themselves, but also in the parts of the industrials economy that are exposed to aftermarket aerospace and also new aircraft builds. And then looking at the defense side of the equation, we continue to be in a strong defense spending cycle. There have been a number of global conflicts that have started over the past few years that have led to large-scale depletions in equipment and munitions for the United States and its allies. So the next few years we'll continue to see a trend in spending to replenish that. That's been a focus for the previous administration and this incoming one, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars in outlays, not just this year, but over the next several years.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple things that I'm trying to keep my eye on. One, Peter mentioned it earlier, nuclear power. We're here in central Pennsylvania, and so we've heard a good deal about 3 Mile Island turning back on one of those reactors. There's a lot of technology in the small modular reactor space. We tend to think a lot of that's a little early right now, but something we're definitely keeping our eye on. another obvious one would be connected to the electrical grid that Peter mentioned, would be some of the E&C companies, engineering and construction. A lot of these firms have more work than they know what to do with as we build out the grid and build some additional power sources. And then I guess one last one that I'm trying to keep my eye on is residential home building. We might be seeing the first signs of life in residential home building for the first time in many years. And so it'll be interesting to see what young buyers are looking at this year, if they can kind of get past the fact that maybe those 2 to 3% interest rates were a historical anomaly and we're now back to, even though it doesn't feel like historic normal rates, rates that are more in line with what they have been over the last 10, 20 years. So do they start to come off the sidelines and start to make purchasing activity? We're starting to see the first signs of that, but we'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, and so those are some of the subsectors that are doing well, but we're also starting to see some encouraging signs from what have been the laggards as well. We sense that 2024 may have been the bottom in the deeply cyclical industrial subsectors like base metals, chemicals, packaging. These tend to be less differentiated, and they should benefit from the policies of the new administration. These policies are intended to support domestic producers, and the companies tend to be the kinds of stocks that savvy value investors buy when nobody else wants them. These eventually flip from value to cyclical growth stocks as the economy recovers, so you want to be early on those, and we think that time could very well be now.
Well, let's hope. And I know if there's anyone on top of it, it's you three. So I think that kind of wraps things up for us in terms of time today. But Scott, Peter, Erik, thank you all so much. And please, audience, check back in on teamemerald.com, news and insights page for more insights from our investment analysts, and more 6 weeks of Groundhog will be coming to your inbox. All right, thank you. Take care.